Hello, hello. So we're just days away from National Native American Heritage Month, and I have no other than Valerie Red Horse Mohl.
Yes.
And she just recently, joined our bureau at Nota Inclusion. And Valerie, such an honor to work with.
Oh, no, it's my honor to be here, and thank you for recognizing Native American Heritage Month and having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and you and I were just talking of before joining this call about, you know, the what is happening in today's news. Can you tell us a little bit about it and just the importance of, like you were just saying, like really getting to know tribal nations and its history and et cetera?
Absolutely. I mean, Native American tribal history is very much a part of our country's history, and yet we've seen over the decades and centuries a little bit of bearing that history, maybe not always teaching it accurately. And we're definitely seeing some positive changes. And what I was mentioning to you is this week is very significant in that President Biden just flew to the Gila River Reservation in Arizona, where he publicly gave an apology to all of the tribal nations for the egregious situation that occurred in the boarding school, the forced boarding school situation that we had in the late 1800s and into the 1900s, even into the 1960s and 70s. And it was a horrific history that needs to be explored, and maybe there's um, maybe there's some justice in there, but the whole point is recognizing that there is a sad history there that was systemic.
Mhm.
And so, for those of us that work with tribes and in the tribal community, I think we all feel appreciative, but now we want to see, what does the apology lead to? Is there some action? And for me, I've always been focused on definitely looking at the past and making sure those bad behaviors and those sad behaviors are not repeated. But how can we move forward with economic development, and how can our communities thrive? And it is an important step for that recognition. And so I'm very appreciative. As I mentioned to you, my father was a product of the boarding school system, and it left marks on him emotionally.
I was just going to say, for some people, this is a generation away.
Right, exactly. And yet, to that point, in the Native community, most of us believe that anything that happens affects 7 generations. It really does affect the future generations. And my father was a great man. He was an activist, very involved in Native rights and tribal rights and land back. But he never was able to establish relationships. He didn't have that trust in relationships because he had been taken from his parents at a very early age. And most of us children were raised by our mothers because he would be around maybe 1 or 2 years and then he'd be off. And I, at first, was, as a young person, I thought that was, I was mad at him. Let's put it that way. I felt a little bit of anger. And then when I realized he'd been taken and put into a boarding school and then a relocation program, really is, he was a product of failed government policies.
I think about what happened and how they were like stripped away from who they are, and how that takes so many, like you were just saying, it impacts many generations because just the the reconnecting and reclaiming and rerouting.
Well, what is so interesting, yes, there was horrific behavior. Children were beaten, children were killed. And yet, this whole attempt to anglicize the Indian and take away our culture and our language actually failed. If
Yeah.
you think about how strong our culture is, even in tribal nations where there is very little economic development, I still see the traditions, whether it's singing and dancing, basket weaving, whatever the culture traditions are of that tribe. I love how we have survived and we are thriving from a cultural standpoint. We have not let anyone take that away.
Yeah, and I love your perspective on understanding how to work with tribal nations and your background. So tell me a little bit about your background and then that perspective that you bring into the sessions that you do.
Sure. So, my father, who I mentioned previously, was born in and around Indian territory in Oklahoma. He was full blood Cherokee. And he, as I mentioned, was sent to a boarding school. He was then sent to a work program and eventually a relocation program, all at the hands of the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And he ended up in California. That has actually been a positive for me. So I've been born and raised in California, and I actually love California. I love the weather and the beaches. But he was an activist. He was very involved with getting the Department of War, which is where the BIA used to be housed. He ended that with a group. They protested and said we should be in the Department of Interior, not the Department of War, because what message does that send? And that was, I think, in the 50s. And so both he and my mother, who was 100% English, so I'm half and half, taught me to be an activist. And where I've landed in my activism is more as a financial activist, in that I come with 10 securities licenses and work with economic development. I've helped fund tribal hospitality ventures, as well as expansion into things like renewable energy is part of my passion right now for tribal nations. And then I'm also a filmmaker. It's been important to me. I majored in film in college, and it's been important for me that we can tell our stories. And so I've gravitated to mostly doing documentary films led by a tribe or a tribal nation or a group of Native people saying, here's a story we want told. And that's been a real joy. But I would say there's probably more impact in the financial activism and just, being able to understand how we can participate in American economies where we can grow and expand and actually thrive with our own economic development at scale.
And I like how you bring that perspective of internally within the community, but also externally, right? Like, how can clients better either recruit or partner with tribal nations?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if someone were to say to me, what's the greatest opportunity right now when you think about our over 560 tribal nations, it's partnerships. We've had some very successful partnerships, what I would call public private. So the tribal government partnering with private enterprise. We saw it in the gaming industry, obviously. There's been some great partnerships with like Harrah's as an example. But when it comes to other industries, we haven't really scratched the surface of that. And I think there's so many benefits economically for a private enterprise partner to work with a tribal nation. There's tax benefits, there's sovereign immunity in certain ways where you can do things that maybe you couldn't do. With gaming as an example, we had exclusivity on reservation land. And I just think we are people that enjoy partnerships, enjoy being in the community. And I would like to get a message out of, come join us, come talk to us, come work with us. And I think there are many people who would like to, but maybe just don't understand who we are as tribal nations. What does it mean? How do you work with a tribal nation? And I also think in the finance space, it's really interesting now to start seeing there are indigenous fund managers and investment opportunities where you're getting that sense of native responsibility for the earth and for people. And so it's a whole different level of what some people would call ESG or impact investing, but I think it's predated that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and talk to me a little bit about the sessions. And I mean, you mentioned it already that you give that perspective, but why is it so important that companies host these sessions right now?
I think America has missed the mark on really understanding who our tribal nations are, fact versus fiction. And my whole life, I have been speaking in schools. I teach part time at Stanford, and I really do think that the average American citizen, if you were to say, can you explain tribal sovereignty? What does it mean? What does it doesn't? Do Native people pay taxes? Which of course we do. And just understanding the treaty relationship with the federal government and how tribes have to support themselves. We don't have a tax benefit on the reservation. And just understanding how important economic development is and understanding our culture and the beauty of the land that everyone lives on. Recently, we have seen a custom sort of implemented where people will do a land acknowledgement. So, as an example, I live in the San Francisco area, so I'm coming to you right now from the Muwekma Ohlone ancestral land. But it's more than just ancestral land. They're still an active tribe. They're still very, very active with sacred sites and doing things that go way beyond economic development, cultural sensitivity, cultural importance. And so I think for everyone who lives in America, it's important to understand whose ancestral land do you live on? Is there a way to go to the museum and have your children understand those cultures and those customs? And it really just enhances our world when we can understand that.
Mm. I was just at an event a couple of weeks ago, and they started honoring the land and honoring, what the tribal nation that used to live there, and I just thought it was so beautiful to just even have that awareness and presence that, and just like you said, how many people don't have any knowledge or even idea of even the land that they live in now. And it's so important for our sense of belonging to be connected to where we are.
Right. And I also think it's a sense of unity. I do believe that governmental policies on both sides of the aisle, to be clear, have created divisiveness. And so many people avoid tribal, contact, thinking, oh, maybe tribes are angry at the white man, which I understand that. But honestly, we want to work together. We want to understand ways that are beneficial to work together now and to interact together, especially with school children. The museums on some of the tribal reservations are amazing. And I think the one message I keep hearing as I work with tribal leaders is yes, our history has some very sad parts to it, like the boarding school situation, like forced assimilation and relocation programs. But we survived. We're here, and we're joyous. We're happy, and we celebrate our culture and our traditions. And we don't want people to think we're stuck in the past. 500 years ago. And I think it's important that young students as well as adults understand who we are now and what that means to have neighbors who are tribal nations and how it can be a positive thing.
It's so powerful. I get chills because you think of, the genocides that are happening in today's world and thinking that you all went through that, right? And how it's like you were saying, not so many generations away, and that trauma that carries that. But like you were saying, even even with that, recognizing that, but then seeing how they're thriving and the beauty of what they've preserved and who they are and the connection to the earth, which all of us are so disconnected. I think we
That
have so much to learn from
That's exactly right. I love how much integration into daily life with tribal traditions and culture is the respect for the earth. Many places I go before we have a meeting, not only is there some sort of prayer, but often you put something like tobacco or herbs down on the earth because if you're taking, you also want to be giving back. And what I notice, it's not a one-time thing. This is integrated into daily life. We give back, we think about the earth, we think about the land we stand on, we think about the people. And if you think of the full circle of life, the tribal community tends to think about ancestors and respecting ancestral wisdom and knowledge, but also future generations, like I said, down to 7 generations and beyond. And so that kind of knowledge and awareness of ancestors and future generations, just I don't see that exist in my career like on Wall Street. I've never had a spiritual moment in my career on Wall Street, but I have brought tribal nations and tribal leaders into offices on Wall Street, and I love that interaction because you're bringing two worlds that normally don't get together too often, but there can be amazing synergies and lessons learned on both sides.
It's so interesting to think that money is energy, right? And how disconnected it is from, I mean, from, yeah, just thinking about, I read a really good book called The Soul of Money, and the author, really dived in into the communities that had never had access to money. and how they thrived without it. And so I just, and what that interaction was the first time that they had access to money. And so to me, it doesn't make sense that it's disconnected from that. If the source of it is such an important part of our lives, and like you were saying, it's something we get and we have to give in order to get more of.
Well, when you think about money, I did some work with the Mashantucket Pequot tribe, which is on the East Coast in Connecticut, and they recognize that their jewelry, which is now made of wampum, it's a beautiful stone, was actually the first currency here in the United States before it was, in fact, the United States. And, you know, Native tribes had very well developed trade routes and trade economies, and so now when we jump forward and we see the implementation of gaming, and whether you're a fan of gaming or not, it's been an economic engine for our communities. And there were people who thought, tribal nations aren't going to be able to handle, running hospitality, big, large casino resorts. And it's a $32 billion industry. Our tribal resorts and casinos are some of the best in the country and the largest in the country. And we really have been able to thrive as business people because it is in our culture and our background and our heritage to think about business and economy. But the difference is it is on behalf of the community. Usually it is not one person trying to get wealthy. I think, right now the stats are 10% of the wealth is held. 67% of the wealth in this country is held by 10% of the people. And that doesn't make sense to a Native mentality. We want economic development to be equitable. It's always on behalf of community. And we think of our elders and we think of our children, like I said. And so, part of my goal in life is to see how can we bring that community mentality into a world that is capitalistic, but there's a way to have both, and I'm really focused on that, the equitable distribution of capital, working with our tribal nations as partners to be able to scale some of these exciting business opportunities. And I truly believe we can make a difference if we start to work together like that.
Yeah, I agree. And then one of the exciting things when we work with you, Valerie, is that the clients will have access to a film. And that, can you talk a little bit about your latest film?
Absolutely. And I do love film. I think film is an amazing genre for education as well as entertainment, but also, in my opinion, films start conversations and then can lead to action and impact. And so every one of my films has had what I would call an impact campaign around it. But my latest film was for PBS, and it was a feature-length documentary. My co-producer is Gail Ann Hurd, who many people might know from, she has an amazing career. She produces The Walking Dead and did Aliens and Terminator. And so she's amazing. And we have a partnership where we, produce and direct documentaries about important Native American topics. And the latest one was about Wilma Mankiller, who was the first elected female chief of the Cherokee Nation, which is my nation. And way beyond the borders of her own reservation, she overcame racism and sexism and worked on behalf of her nation and women in general. She was very close to Gloria Steinem, very active in the women's movement. She made changes that led to enormous economic development on her reservation in Oklahoma, as well as working with presidents. She worked with both President Reagan and President Clinton. She did not pick sides. She was very much a servant leader. And the message of her film is not only servant leadership, but she encourages women to run for office regardless of their background, because she at one point was homeless, living in a car. And I think the message was, you don't have to be connected like a Kennedy, and she was really active in supporting women and elevating women. And I love that part of the story. But she also, in her autobiography before she passed, said that if ever there was a film made about her, she wanted it to include the history of the Cherokee Nation. And so, like I mentioned before, she was very much into looking back and understanding the history, but then also looking forward. She was the one who implemented gaming on the Cherokee Nation. And now we have, I think, 10 casinos, and we're the number one, I think, employer in Oklahoma. So you just see this wonderful woman, and her leadership style should be in everyone's lesson book on how to be a good servant leader that does not buy into the divisiveness of divisive politics.
It's beautiful, and I think also such an example of something I'm very interested in, actually, Valerie, since many years ago, was getting to connect with the rituals and the story of Native women and how they, and their connection to the earth and their own empowerment and leadership, and have been learning from many leaders over the years, but that's definitely something that is very present to me.
Well,
And
I think you would be interested to know because I love it. But in the Native community, historically and even now, there are more women in leadership than anywhere that I know of, especially the US government. So there are many women who are tribal chairwomen. And the one other thing I love is many tribes have what we call grandmother councils, where they recognize the wisdom of older women. And so historically, men would even come seek the wisdom of their grandmothers before going into war and battle. And so there wasn't this divisiveness around gender roles. It was really understanding who are the wise people that we need to talk to before making important decisions. And I really hope we can get back to that. Because I think both sides of the aisle have strayed from that in our country, but I'd like to see more women in office of any background, and I'd like to see us really respect the wisdom of people who maybe aren't elected, and just understand that government leadership should be for everyone and not just one side or the other.
I think we're going to end there because that just seems like a powerful ending. If this didn't convince you to bring Valerie in, I don't know what else will. You're amazing, and I'm really inspired by your work and activism. And I know that you're also heading right now to a conference to speak. So good luck with that.
Oh, thank you, Ingrid. It's my pleasure to be working with you. And I really do enjoy interacting with different businesses and different sectors, and would love to, have an opportunity to interact with anyone who wants to learn more about Native culture or Native business and how to work with our tribes, or just to enjoy the history and the understanding of our people.
Thank you, Valerie. I hope you have a good flight.
Thank you so much. Take care.